In light of the recent departure of Cardinal Robert Sarah, the precarious state of the traditional liturgy and its inseparable link to traditional Catholic teaching should be made more clear. A few weeks ago I reported that the Latin Mass was under threat due to the actions of the French Conference of Catholic Bishops, who responded to the survey issued by the Vatican last summer on their opinions of the traditional liturgy, a survey to be taken only by the bishops of each national conference. When I reported on that, I said the Latin Mass was under serious threat due to the actions of those bishops, who in France had nothing but venom for the traditional liturgy and for those attached to it, and said that the traditional liturgy had nothing but a negative effect in their dioceses. This despite all the traditional orders quietly getting along and avoiding the silly infighting that we see fueled by internet personalities in mostly America, and those same priestly orders having rapid growth in vocations and packed masses in those countries, and especially in France. In France, the bishops responded extremely poorly to this, for obvious reasons, and have reported nothing but hostility to the Latin Mass and traditional sacraments being offered in their dioceses. With the ouster of Cardinal Sarah, this is all put in a new light, and today that will be made more clear by this letter that I have in response to the fresh bishops, which was issued by the Federatio Internationalis Una Voce, which stands as a retort to the bishops in France. Now, I'll have a link to this on the Sources blog for you. I can't post it here on YouTube because our hosts don't particularly like that sort of thing. But in essence, this letter attempts to remind the bishops of the good those communities do in France, while pointing out the obvious to the French bishops. I have it for you here in full, followed by some thoughts on this and the state of things on this front. Statement on the report of the French Bishops' Conference on the implementation of Summorum Pontificum. The FIUV has become aware of a document in the public domain containing a summary of the responses made by the French bishops to the questionnaires sent to them by the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith on the subject of the implementation of the Apostolic Letter Summorum Pontificum. Although this document does not appear to have been intended for publication, its authenticity has not been denied, and a reaction seems necessary to it. We note first that the document adopts a consistently hostile tone towards the ancient Latin liturgical tradition, to the priests who celebrate it, and to the faithful who attend it. This has understandably caused inconsiderable hurt among French Catholics attached to this tradition. The document does not speak, on behalf of the bishops of France, about these sons and daughters of the Church with the words of a shepherd and father. In the words of Una Voce France, we do not find, quote, the slightest trace of empathy, cordiality, or heart in them, as they say in one place. Instead, we find contempt, at best indifference, towards those narrow-minded beings, without theology, without charity, that are the faithful to the ancient Latin Mass, a Mass that so many generations followed, and from which they nourished their faith, which is ours today. End quote. Nevertheless, the impression of hostility made by this document masks many positive features of the reception of Summorum Pontificum in France. The document acknowledges this phenomena with a singular lack of grace, or without noting even that there are good things. It refers, for example, to quote-unquote large families requesting the extraordinary form, to quote-unquote weak young people seeking out celebrations and finding in them a supportive spiritual environment, of seminarians learning to celebrate the extraordinary form in their own time without the assistance of their formators, and to this younger, more traditionally inclined generation of priests celebrating the ordinary form with greater reverence and fidelity. In this context, the words of Father Claude Barth, chaplain of the Summorum Pontificum pilgrimage in Rome, are apposite. One is left speechless by the conclusion that the extraordinary form is not missionary, when we know that the parish masses are always more deserted, while traditional masses are full of young people and a not insignificant number of converts. End quote. We should like to observe that the authority of the bishops of France, like bishops all over the world, remains unimpaired by Summorum Pontificum, as Pope Benedict XVI emphasized in the letter to bishops which accompanied the apostolic letter. Quote, nothing is taken away, then, from the authority of the bishop, whose role remains that of being watchful that all is done in peace and serenity. End quote. Indeed, while this document of the CEF makes harsh criticisms of those priests who celebrate the extraordinary form, it was the bishops themselves, or their immediate predecessors, who in nearly all cases invited them into their dioceses, and presumably did so for good reasons. In a different way, the document laments the small number of diocesan clergy who celebrate the extraordinary form, in relation to the number of priests of the traditional institutes, while it is entirely in the power of the bishops to ensure that their seminarians are proficient in Latin, and to encourage them to learn how to celebrate the extraordinary form. Taking the document as a whole, despite its many harsh and sometimes inaccurate and unjust statements, it reflects the fact that the ancient Mass is now an indisputably permanent feature of the French Church. To quote Father Barth again, quote, "It is clear that the public existence of the traditional Mass is now a given, una fait acquis, in France. It is a given that many bishops would like to confine or reduce it, but that they no longer dispute it." End quote. The FIUV would like to appeal to the bishops of France and to those functionaries of the CEF responsible for this document to consider the consequences of even the appearance of an unwelcoming attitude towards Catholics who feel the attraction of the ancient liturgical tradition. As we have already quoted Pope Benedict, it is the munus of the bishops to ensure that the apostolic letter is implemented with quote-unquote peace and serenity. Peace and serenity are maximized by an open and welcoming attitude. This is also what is necessary to building up the trust and mutual understanding, which this document claims are currently lacking. If traditional Catholics are feeling marginalized, it is in large part because of the contrary attitude displayed by this document, which appears to them to see them as a nuisance rather than as sons and daughters of their bishops. To quote again Pope Benedict's letter to bishops, quote, "Let us generously open our hearts and make room for everything the faith allows." End quote. That was the text of the response to the French bishops' rather hostile response to the traditional liturgy in their country. Let's put this in the light of the recent resignation of Cardinal Robert Sarah. First, it is to be made clear here that Cardinal Sarah issued his resignation in the summer of 2020, and at that time, Francis chose to keep Cardinal Sarah on in his post, probably due to the aftermath of the Amazon Synod and his desire to craft a Amazon liturgy. And Cardinal Sarah's post was at the Congregation of Divine Worship and the Sacraments. This isn't at the same post that issued the survey last summer. However, the Congregation of Divine Worship, which Cardinal Sarah was the head of until recently, is really focused on the Latin Mass, among other things, as you can tell by its name. Their duties related to the Mass include regulation and promotion of the liturgy, primarily of the sacraments, regulation of the administration of the sacraments, especially regarding their valid and licit celebration, promoting liturgical pastoral activity, especially regarding the celebration of the Eucharist, drawing up and revision of liturgical texts, reviewing particular calendars and proper texts for the Mass and the Divine Office, granting the recognitio to the translations of liturgical books and their adaptations, promoting the liturgical apostolate or sacred music, song or art, ensuring that liturgical norms are accurately observed, and that misuses are avoided and eliminated where they are found to exist, among other duties. Now, it's pretty obvious at this point how this is connected to the reception of the Latin Mass in the Vatican, and Cardinal Sarah was in a key position to defend not only the Latin Mass, but the Novus Ordo in its more reverent form, the so-called unicorn masses that present the liturgy more in keeping with Catholic form than is typically seen in, unfortunately, the vast majority of diocesan parishes anywhere you go. Any move to restore sanctity and reverence to the liturgy and to eliminate the clown masses that infest the Church would be coordinated from that office, and any attempt to suppress the Latin Mass and priestly fraternities dedicated to it would be absolutely centered there as well. In the 1980s, John Paul II issued Ecclesia Dei to permit the bishops to have the traditional liturgy in their dioceses if they so wished, and it was the Congregation for Divine Worship that was tasked with overseeing this. Summorum Pontificum expanded greatly on this work. Cardinal Sarah was tasked with overseeing this as well as the other Latin Rite liturgical norms. Cardinal Sarah was the main obstacle to the suppression of the Latin Mass, should Francis decide to move against Summorum Pontificum, and I think he will. We've had numerous indications of that by now. When all this will happen is another question, and the answer to that question And what comes next, Forsum Morum Pontificum and the Latin Mass, will be answered when we find out who Francis chooses to replace Cardinal Sarah with. If he chooses an out-and-out modernist, and I think that's likely, then you'll have your answer, and many Catholics will eventually be faced with an unpleasant choice between increasingly modernist liturgies or attending Mass with groups that many voices have waged an unrelenting agitprop war of attrition against. Time will tell. But this infighting and hostility to these priestly fraternities really needs to come to an end. The effect Cardinal Sarah had on this should not be underestimated, and for his work defending the gains traditionalists have made in preserving the liturgy and traditional teachings in the past 2 decades, all faithful Catholics should thank him. That is despite him making some very, very strange and Luther-esque sounding statements about the Rock and Peter lately, statements that I don't even know what he meant. I'm sure you've heard about them. If not, someone in the comments will happily let you know about it. But what do you think about this? About the effect Cardinal Sarah's dismissal will have on the liturgy? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, pray for the Church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.